Thought, they say the American dream is owning a home with a white picket fence, but they never mention the nightmare that comes with the person holding the clipboard on the other side of that fence. And I learned that the hard way on a Tuesday morning that started with nothing more than a fresh cup of coffee and the smell of old diesel. My name is Miller Vance, and after 20 years of serving as a chief petty officer in the Navy, I thought I'd seen every kind of power-hungry commander there was, from the bridge of a destroyer to the back docks of international ports, but none of them compared to Mrs. Beatrice Thorne. She was the self-appointed queen of, the orchards, a neighborhood that looked like it was plucked out of the catalog but felt like a minimum security prison if you didn't mow your lawn at a 45-degree angle. And there she was clicking her heels across my driveway at 7 in the morning while I was still trying to shake off the jet lag from my final deployment. I was standing there, leaning against the hull of the Sovereign, which ISN and oppose. Just some boat, and oppose. As a decommissioned 28-foot Navy coastal interceptor that I spent 3 years of my life and every cent of my savings restoring to honor my late father, who served in the same unit. And before I could even say, good morning, Beatrice slapped a bright neon orange sticker right onto the pristine military-grade hull. She looked me dead in the eye, adjusted her pearl necklace like she was preparing for a press conference, and said, Miller, your service might get you a discount at the local diner, but it doesn't oppose. Buy you a pass on Section 4, Article B of the Community Covenant. This oversized eyesore is a commercial vehicle, and military people aren't oppose. As special as they think they are when it comes to property values. I just stood there for a second, watching the steam rise from my mug, feeling that familiar heat crawl up the back of my neck. The kind you get when a junior officer tries to tell you how to do a job you oppose. You've been doing since before they hit puberty. But I kept it cool, because if the Navy teaches you anything, it's that you never fire until you've identified the target and confirmed the range. I told her Beatrice, this ISN oppose. Commercial vehicle, it oppose. As a registered maritime vessel, and more importantly, it oppose. Is currently under a temporary federal maintenance status, But she didn't oppose. Do you want to hear it? She just waved her clipboard like it was a scepter and told me I had 48 hours to haul it to a scrapyard or pay a $1,000 daily fine until the HOA seized my property. What she didn't oppose, and what she was about to find out in the most painful way possible, was that she hadn't oppose. Just insulted a neighbor. She had just interfered with a piece of equipment that still carried a federal inventory tag and was protected by more layers of government red tape than her tiny brain could ever process. I watched her strut away, her heels clicking like a countdown timer, and I realized that after 20 years of defending the country, my biggest battle wasn't oppose. Going to be on the high seas, but right here in the cul-de-sac of a suburb in Virginia. I walked inside, sat down at my kitchen table, and ignored the cold coffee while I dialed a number I hadn't oppose. Called in years, my old academy roommate, Silas, who had traded his uniform for a high-priced suit and a corner office at the Pentagon's Legal Liaison Division. When I told him what happened, there was this long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually precedes a massive explosion, and then Silas just started laughing, a deep, dark chuckle that told me Beatrice Thorne had just stepped into a minefield without a map. He told me, Miller, she did what? She put an adhesive sticker on a vessel with an active federal hull number? Tell me you didn't oppose. Peel it off yet, And when I confirmed it was still there, he told me to sit tight, keep my camera rolling, and wait for the documents he was about to flood my inbox with. See, the thing about Beatrice was that she wasn't oppose. Just a stickler for rules. She was a predator who smelled blood in the water. I was a recently retired vet, a single dad trying to raise a headstrong teenage daughter named Maya, and I think she thought I was an easy target who would just roll over to keep the peace. By that afternoon, the neighborhood was already buzzing because Beatrice had been busy. She'd gone door to door with a petition telling everyone that my, war machine, was going to tank their home equity and attract, unstable elements, to our quiet streets. My neighbor from 2 houses down, a guy named Leo, who was a retired high school history teacher and one of the few sane people left in the zip code, came over and told me she was telling people I was running an illegal charter business on my driveway. We were standing there talking when Beatrice reappeared, this time with two other HOA board members who looked like they'd been lobotomized and replaced with, Stepford wife, programming, and she handed me a, final cease and desist, order. Maya, my daughter, came out of the house right then. She's 16, has my temper, and absolutely no filter. And she looked at Beatrice and said, are you seriously this bored? My dad spent 6 months on a carrier so you could spend your days measuring grass. Maybe show a little respect? Beatrice didn't oppose. To even look at her, she just sneered at me and said, the youth of today is as undisciplined as your driveway. If that boat ISN and oppose. Gone by sunset tomorrow. I've already authorized a heavy-duty towing company to come and take it. That was the moment the gentle neighbor, act died. I looked at her and said, Beatrice, I'm going to give you one chance to walk back to your house, look up the definition of federal preemption, and rethink every choice you've made today. Because if you touch that boat, you're not just breaking an HOA rule, you're breaking the law. She laughed, a high-pitched, screeching sound that made my ears ring, and told me that, federal law doesn't oppose. Apply to private property agreements, which was exactly the kind of confident ignorance I was hoping for. The next morning, I didn't oppose. Moved the boat. Instead, I sat on my porch with a fresh pot of coffee and waited, and sure enough, around 10 a.m., a massive tow truck rumbled into the cul-de-sac, followed closely by Beatrice in her white Lexus, looking like she was about to preside over a royal execution. She hopped out, pointing at the Sovereign, and told the driver, that's the one. Take it to the impound lot and don an oppose. Worry about the damage, he was warned. I didn't oppose. I didn't oppose. Scream. I just held up my phone and said, I'm recording this and I'm telling you now, that vessel is federal property under the Service Member Civil Relief Act and currently holds a temporary maritime lien for restoration. If you hook it, you're interfering with government-regulated assets. The tow truck driver, a guy who looked like he'd seen enough drama for 3 lifetimes, paused and looked at the hull, then at the orange sticker, then back at me, and he saw the look in my eyes, the look of a man who has stood down pirates. And he shook his head, told Beatrice, Lady, I'm not touching a Navy tag boat. I don an oppose. Care what your HOA says, And he drove off, leaving her standing there in a cloud of exhaust. But Beatrice wasn't an oppose. Done. She was the kind of person who would burn down the whole forest just to kill one spider. And that night, she did something so monumentally stupid it shifted the entire situation from a petty neighborhood squabble into a full-blown federal crisis. She called the Department of Homeland Security and the local police, claiming that I was, stockpiling unregistered munitions, and, preparing a waterborne tactical strike, from my garage. And I know this because 2 hours later, my quiet street was filled with flashing blue and red lights. I walked out with my hands visible, Maya standing in the doorway looking terrified, and I found myself face to face with a young sergeant who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. I explained the situation, showed him my retirement ID, and then I showed him the Sovereign, which, for the record, has absolutely no weapons on it. It's a hull, an engine, and some navigation gear. The sergeant sighed, looked at Beatrice, who was standing on her lawn shouting about, domestic threats, and he told me, Commander, I'm sorry about this. We have to respond to these calls, but she's really pushing it, That was when the tables started to turn, because Silas, my academy buddy, hadn't oppose. He just sent me documents. He'd sent a notification to the regional JAG office and the local FBI field branch because Beatrice's, reports, had triggered a series of automated security flags. The next day, 2 men in dark suits showed up at the neighborhood, but they didn't oppose. Come to my door first. They went to hers. It turns out that when you report a decorated military officer for terrorism because you don oppose, like his boat, the government doesn't oppose. Just sent a polite letter. They start looking into you, and boy, did they find a gold mine. My neighbor Maria, the legal secretary who had been quietly hating Beatrice for years, had been keeping a secret file on the HOA's finances and she brought it over to me that afternoon while the feds were still inside Beatrice's house. End quote. Miller, end quote. She said, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and excitement. End quote. Beatrice hasn't into oppos. T just been a bully. She's been a thief. End quote. It turned out that over the last 5 years, Beatrice had been, end quote, allocating, end quote, nearly 40% of the community's maintenance fees into a shell company that was supposedly doing, end quote, environmental consulting, end quote. But the company's address was just a P.O. box registered to her sister in Florida. She'd been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank to fund her Lexus and her designer wardrobe. And the only reason no one noticed was because she kept everyone so terrified of her, end quote, violation notices, end quote, that they never dared to ask for a full audit. But here's the kicker. Because she had used the U.S. mail to send out those fraudulent invoices and had now used federal resources to file a false report against a military officer to cover her tracks, she had just walked herself right into a RICO investigation. The climax of this whole, end quote, beautiful disaster, end quote, as I like to call it, happened at the emergency HOA meeting 3 days later. The community center was packed. The air was thick with the smell of cheap coffee and tension, and Beatrice stood at the podium, still trying to play the victim. She started talking about, end quote, community safety, end quote, and how I was a, end quote, danger to the children, end quote. But I just stood up, walked to the front, and handed her a manila envelope. End quote, Beatrice, end quote. I said, my voice carrying that low, command deck resonance that used to make sailors jump to attention, end quote. Inside that envelope is a civil suit for defamation, a federal notice of investigation into mail fraud, and a list of 32 neighbors who have signed affidavits regarding your selective enforcement and harassment. End quote. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence you only get right before a storm breaks. And then I turned to the crowd and showed them the photos Maria had found, the invoices for, end quote, lake dredging, end quote, that never happened, and, end quote, landscaping, end quote, that was really just Beatrice's own backyard being remodeled on her dime. The look on her face was worth every second of the deployment I'd just finished. She went from, end quote, neighborhood queen, end quote, to, end quote, cornered rat, end quote, in about 4 seconds flat. She tried to scream that I was faking the documents, but then the FBI agent I'd spoken to earlier stepped out from the back of the room and simply said, end quote, Mrs. Thorne, we need you to come with us for further questioning regarding the financial records found during yesterday's search, end quote. I watched them lead her out in handcuffs, her heels clicking one last time on the linoleum floor. But this time there was no rhythm of power. It was just the sound of someone who had finally run out of luck. Life in the orchards changed pretty fast after that. The boat stayed in the driveway, and Maya and I spent the rest of the summer finishing the restoration, with half the neighborhood stopping by to offer a hand or bring us a beer. We found out that Beatrice had embezzled over $200,000 over the years, and while she's currently serving time and paying back every cent, the neighborhood has actually started to feel like a community again. Leo is the new HOA president. His first act was to abolish the, end quote, grass height, end quote, rule, and the sovereign is finally back in water where she belongs. Looking back, I realized that Beatrice Thorne was right about one thing. Military people aren't in oppos. T, end quote, special, end quote, in the way she meant it, but we're trained to recognize an enemy, to hold our ground, and to never let a bully dictate the terms of the engagement. But it makes me wonder how many other, end quote, Beatrices, end quote, are out there right now, holding a clipboard and a grudge, ruining lives one orange sticker at a time? Was I right to go full, end quote, nuclear, end quote, on her, or should I have tried to find a middle ground with a woman who clearly had a screw loose? I've heard people say I was too harsh, that I should have just moved the boat to avoid the drama. But if you don an oppos, stand up for your rights on your own property, what do you stop? I want to know what you would have done. Would you have let her tow the boat just to keep the peace? Or would you have called in the cavalry like I did? Drop a comment below and let me know if you think I'm the hero of this story or just another guy who took a neighborhood feud way too far. Because honestly, for where I'm sitting on the deck of my boat, the view looks pretty clear to me.